You walk through the streets of London in 1665, and every alley seems to smell not just of rot, but also fear. Mothers huddled against their children, merchants locked their doors and windows, and an invisible, implacable killer bent his head and shuffled through the streets. Soon enough, neighbors are melted, funeral services spill out into the streets, and rumors of God's wrath spread. The year was 1665, and this was the Great Plague of London, a nightmare of human suffering that swept across an entire city, killing thousands, decimating families, and bringing one of the greatest cities in Europe to its trembling knees. Today, the post-game digs into the pestilence, reveals the extreme efforts, and explores the human anecdotes frequently untold when history was written. But before we delve further into some 1665 London horrors, consider subscribing and hit the notification bell. Your inner history buff is committed to never missing the untold stories of survival, betrayal, and despair. Be sure to like and share this with those friends who think history is strictly a course for the outdated books. Some truths are much scarier than fiction. London was just another year in 1665, streets filled with people, markets overflowing, and the putrid miasma of the River Thames hanging heavily as ever. Yet, in the long and narrow inner lanes of the city's worst parts, an invisible terror has started brewing. Physicians in the city heard stories of bizarre boils, fevers, and swelling lymph nodes. The rich laughed it off, a moderate inconvenience, swiftly an outbreak unworthy of all his flurry. By May, the disease had taken over. Traders would become bedridden, entire families disappeared overnight, and the very whispers of some lethal infection seemed to have outpaced the local heralds. As people began to die in greater numbers, panic replaced reason. Its near-empty streets evoked the eerie stillness more typical of a war zone, with residents barricading themselves in homes across enfeebled neighborhood. The city's officials had a hard time keeping the peace, and watchmen walked the empty alleys, shouting the names of the dead for registration and burial. If they had enough money to leave, left their homes, and deserted all the infected. The rich moved to the fields. They were okay, while those poor souls that remained in this overcrowded city suffered the most. The moans of the ill rang ominously through dim aisles, echoing like haunting passages in an orchestral fugue. The very children themselves became orphaned by it all, and while the plague knew no class boundaries, it savaged the poorest most brutally. They were afflicted with virulent swellings, enduring couple of days with the fever at best, and the chill being relentless. Blood seeped from their noses and they raved in delirium, only to die within days. There was nothing doctors could do. In fact, their treatments were likely to make conditions worse. The street was strewn with the dead, and there was no room in cemeteries for them. Makeshift pits were dug in a hurry, and cart drivers shouted as uplifted bodies were transferred to communal graves. As fear of contagion rived the once continent family cause, thousands died to unlistened screams in a city that was becoming emptier with each passing hour. In a bid to stop the spread of the pandemic, authorities resorted to extreme methods. Houses with those stricken by the illness were sealed off, and red crosses painted on their doors with guards posted outside. All too late quarantines were imposed. Since the pandemic was attributed to the wrath of God, in support of superstition, increased religious processions and prayers to confront anxiety. Physicians would take a rudimentary face mask filled with herbs that provided pleasant odors, thinking of their defense against the plague. Apothecaries were also in business, flogging charms, elixirs, and strange concoctions, none of which could stymie the silent terror tearing through the masses. Out of the tragedy came stories of human survival. Families embraced, making themselves vulnerable to sickness. Local people will be remembered to take food to the sick, exposing themselves to death for another human. Yet, betrayal also surfaced. Many have disowned other members from their families for fear of becoming infected. As the city emptied, looting was rampant. Merchants buried their treasures, and gangs of looters rose among the common rabble in the streets and alleys. Terrified and hungry, children roamed the streets alone. Many placed in foster care to other families. The plague was an ethical as much as a physiological catastrophe for humanity. A City of Ghosts by September 1665, London. According to official records, more than 100,000 people died, nearly 15% of the city's population. Churches were filled with mourners, and the commons beyond the city limits recovered mass graves. Whole neighborhoods emptied, dressing empty buildings with sad clothes and squeezing markets silent. Remnants were traumatized, mourning, poor and constantly afraid that the plague might come back. The economy stumbled, trade lagged, and the social character of London was permanently altered. By the winter of 1666, the plague waned, though no one can say for sure why. The colder weather, some say, could have helped slow the flea-borne transmission of the deadly superbug. Some say survivors' general natural immunity may have accounted for the drop. But the scars of the plague remained. Survivors buried the dead, reconstructed homes, and tried to revive business. Still, the memory of the pain endured grew strong enough to have an impact on literature, medicine, and urban planning for centuries. It tells a tale of how easy it is to bring humanity down, and how easy be to end our lives, most brazenly, beautifully sung in the Great Plague of London. It reinforced the value of public health interventions, hygiene, and social safety nets. It was a hard lesson for the also fledgling physicians as well, that spread like wildfire, shaping how we currently approach epidemics, offering a tool now in use. Strategies with automatic outcomes. Apart from medical lessons, the most profound aspects of the plague had unveiled. Human courage and compassion, selfishness as well, cowardice so deeply penetrated in the very fabric of a beleaguered city. And history remembers those who did not survive, but it also remembers the survivors who carried on despite such unimaginable horrors. The streets of London later returned to normal, the markets reopened and life went on. It was still the Great Plague, a dark part of history ingrained in exposed flesh, evidence of civilization's vulnerability and man's perseverance. The tales of loss, courage, and anguish persist long and loudly in our memories, for even as the darkest hour approaches, humanity endures. London, 1665. Plague has reared its head again, and the populace is gripped in its deadly hold. Whole streets are deserted now, their windows nailed up, doors chalked with red crosses chanting, "God have mercy on us." The air reeks of death, and the piercing clang of a church bell is its own form of silence, between the groans heard in squeaky death carts. But behind the closed doors, unspeakable tragedies are happening. Children lying starving at the side of their parents who have died. Neighbors made to burn items from the corpses, and officials offered bribes to cover up what had occurred. Now, this was no longer an outbreak. This was a city under siege, a place where taking a breath could be your last one, and any knock on your door could mark you for death. But be sure to subscribe for even more chilling true stories from London history before we unlock the deadlier chapters in her past. Like if you too want to reveal human truths, centuries hidden by shrouded silence, and send this immediately to someone who thinks they could live in a city of slowly drowned death. For when you learn what happened next, you might wonder how long it would take before you'd do the same to stay alive. By the dog days of 1665, London's quarantine was a fate worse than death for many. The moment a family member came down with symptoms, the door was painted with red paint in the shape of a huge cross over which were scrawled the words, "Lord have mercy upon us." There were guards posted outside to make sure no one could come in or out. Families were quarantined with the sick and would usually watch each member shrivel away until none were left. Provisions came irregularly, and sometimes not at all. Hunger, thirst, and despair are as mortal as the disease itself. Across Europe, the guards enforcing quarantines consisted of a rough mix of brave, corrupt, and desperate men. Upon some, the motive was genuine thought for defense of the city, and they sought infection every hour. All their living together bribed others to lead the well away in darkness. Stories circulated of watchmen who were pilfering homes of the dead for finery, silverware, and anything else that might serve them a semblance of innocence in riches as they nailed doorways shut. These stories fueled suspicion in the public, and before long, tensions between the public and law enforcement were reaching a breaking point. The city's physicians, best known for their bird-beaked masks, worked door to door giving treatments that would prove unhelpful and even tortuous with time. They cut open buboes, bled patients, and recommended that they apply poultices of dried toad or pigeon shit, constructed with holes for the nose and two small cradles to rest against their cheek. They would fill the masks with spices such as lavender, camphor or vinegar-soaked sponges in an effort to protect themselves from miasma, which was thought to be bad-smelling air that caused disease. Not enough doctors made it out alive. Most fled after weeks of watching all their patients die for nothing. Some were called heroes for staying, others opportunists. Churchyards had filled up a long time ago, so the city created huge plague pits, trenches to bury hundreds of bodies in at once. Death carts rumbling through the streets with a driver to shout, "Bring out your dead!" Desperate families often cried as they brought out the dead in sheets. There were no time to mourn or hold ceremonies. Their bodies were simply dumped into the pits, some lime poured down to deaden the pong, and a hasty layer of earth thrown over. Others muttered that not everyone beneath the ground was even dead. The fat cats left London for good as the body count mounted. The king and his court retired to Oxford, and the Lord Mayor was in charge of the city. Wealthy merchants or landowners departed to their country estates with families in tow. Carriages were traffic jammed at the city gates. Only the poor who couldn't get out watched, resentful as the wealthy drove away from their nightmares. They vacuumed the city of its leadership, talent, resources, and optimism, rather like the classically estranged chickens that have found their way to roost where now only working classes remain, to absorb all the powers of nature which are about them. Children wandered the streets in tatters and foraged or begged for food, having lost their parents, with extended family either reluctant or unable to let them move in. Others banded together in small gangs to defend themselves, filching loaves of bread and bottom-of-the-barrel scraps from unwatched market stalls. Others were taken in by charities, but living conditions were pitiful. In the overcrowded orphanages, disease ran rampant, and most of the children died within weeks. The trauma would last forever among the survivors, who have their childhood stolen away by the plague. Desperation and fear made men harsh. There were reports of landlords evicting well tenants rather than face the prospect of a quarantine that might mean them rent. In some cities, when neighbors suspected someone of harboring the plague, they would drag that person from his or her house and leave him or her at the city gates. Mobs in a few districts even assaulted doctors, accusing them of infecting people. But rather than pinning the blame on homegrown authority figures who lied to them, they lashed out at non-natives, accusing foreign entities and strangers of poisoning wells or spreading disease into the city. It was a plague, an infection that contaminated not just bodies, but minds. Amid the chaos, religious extremists and street preachers even took to the streets, announcing that it was a plague sent by God to smite the city's sins. There were calls for a general repentance, with the encouragement of book and play burnings, and indeed anything else reflective of moral turpitude. Parades and communal prayers were also held, creating an environment under which the disease could only spread further. London had been treated to predictions of Armageddon for years, and in the eyes of many Londoners, those predictions were coming true. Even as 1665 drew to a close, the plague still was nowhere near over. Yet this time another disaster was looming, of a completely different kind. During the summer of 1666, there were rumors of public disorder, scarcities, and insurrection. Each of those closely spaced tinderboxes was a house made of wooden planks and thin timber. What nobody could have foreseen, in a matter of just a few short months, the very flames which would consume so much of London might also serve to sweep the plague from its streets. Official records recorded 68,596 dead by the end of 1665, but most historians estimate over 100,000 perished in total. The population of London had been shattered, its economy smashed, and the streets plagued with a mute echo of endless death. Survivors just got used to the fact that you always lost every time. But down in the heart of the city, a small flame still flickered. Maybe, perhaps, life would find its way back yet. However, fate was to deal one final catastrophic hand.